From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions at Arizona State University. And back for a double dip, we have Dr. Joel Webster, who last week, for those who are listening, you should go back and check it out. We had a whole episode where we discussed Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. And in the process of prepping for that episode, both he and I kind of recognized that we also both have we both have an interest in arguably the most important American grand strategist, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan. And maybe this is, Joel, you're already going to be able to help me out here. Is it Mahan or Mahan? I'm not actually sure how you pronounce it.
I've actually heard both. I usually just call him Mahan because it sounds better to me, but I've heard Mahan as pronunciation quite often.
Just in the general context of what his name comes up in bars and like parties and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very common occurrence, in our world.
Yeah. So anyway, he and I, although neither one of us are military historians, although Dr. Webster, you're probably more of a military historian than I am. Um, we have both, read him, consider him, take him seriously, and we've never really had a good chance to go in on to really dig deep into Mahan. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity for that, and maybe to familiarize listeners with this very important intellectual name in American history, who in the 2020s is probably largely forgotten. Dr. Webster's joining me from down the hall. Dr. Webster, who's been on the show, I think this is his fourth time on the show. He is, like me, he's a teaching fellow here at the Center for American Institutions, and he's a 20th century U.S. historian, particularly in the history of American conservatism. However, not exclusively that. He is a man of many interests and many specialties, and so this will just highlight how true that is. Um, so, Dr. Webster, are you able to maybe begin by offering perhaps a brief introduction to Mahan? Who is this guy?
Yeah, I can do that. It's good to be back again. Um, but I'll start off with kind of a very brief biography here of Mahan. He's born in 1840, in New York, but his father is at West Point teaching, and so he comes from a military family. But he himself is going to actually take the other route and go to the Navy. And he's going to graduate from the Naval Academy, and he's going to get his commission roughly right before the Civil War breaks out. And so he's going to serve in the American Civil War, and then he's going to do almost 40 years worth of service in the U.S. Navy. Part of that's going to be spent kind of the later years at the very new at this time Naval War College in Rhode Island, and he's going to be assigned there as a lecturer in 1885, and then I think he actually is going to become president the following year of the university, and it's kind of while he's there and he's teaching these ideas that he really begins to start, I think, really aggressively writing these out, and so he ends up writing the book that if anyone's ever heard of a book he wrote, it's probably Influences of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783. Looking at, if you're not familiar with what those dates maybe coincide with, the beginning of that is what he considers the dawn of the true quote unquote modern age of sailing, sail ships, and then it ends with the end of the American Revolution. And so that's part of the work he's most famous for, and that comes out in 1890. And he's going to go on to write several other books looking not just at the British and kind of American context, but also very famously about the French experiences both before and after their revolution. But again, why most people are famous for this or know of him, it's this real sense of him kind of pushing and propelling the American system to go on and have a strong Navy. They don't have, and even at the time he's serving, it's still relatively weak. And so he's going to do that. And again, even beyond the American context, you're going to have the Germans and British and other powers, Japanese, even to a smaller degree, they're going to read this work and they're going to apply these ideas. And that's going to lead to this great naval buildup, both right before and then after World War One.
Mhm. So, I mean, this is one of the things about Mahan is that I think he is a broad thinker in the sense that he is highly, you would use the term, I guess, today, interdisciplinary. He's a theorist in many areas, many sectors, many fields. Um, I think, he's sort of been, if you were to have encountered him, maybe not at the the war college, but at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, you probably would have encountered, there's sort of 2 ideas that I think, of Mahan's that people remember him for, and because of that, I think they make him almost an anachronism in the sense that we need more battleships and we wanna fight decisive battles at sea.
Yeah.
And these are sort of the 2 strictly military aspects, or 2 2 aspects of what he's talking about. That, that's what he's remembered for, I think, in a lot of circles, but I hardly think but that does a massive disservice to Mahan's thinking, who, at least the way that I was just describing him to our colleague down the hall, is arguably the most important American grand strategist.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think he is, and this is part of how I stumbled across him because, like you said, I mean, I'm not truly a military historian. I do have strategic studies certificate and that type of thing, and that's one of the ways I encountered him. But I encountered him even earlier than that. Is that I was looking into the foreign policy influences that I thought he had moving into the first couple of decades of the 20th century, and he's very much connected to and influenced and made aware of by all these people, including Teddy Roosevelt, who very much buys into his ideas and is engaged with his ideas. Um, but but as you said, especially in the modern sense, I think most of what he really offers gets kind of diluted or almost made into a caricature of this um, decisive battle, building up these big ships, and at that time again battleships, and that's what's driving again that naval buildup I mentioned earlier. And yet, it proves that most people are, if they're reading him at all, they're reading a very surface level reading of
Yeah.
Baha, because and and they're not even reading the table of contents because if you actually go in and look, uh, he spends it's actually on page 26. He is where he's actually talking about this, and he says it very convolutedly there, but what he describes that page in his table of contents as is much more succinct and much more clear as to his broad intention here. And he says in his table of contents about this page, navies exist for the protection of commerce. Well, that has nothing to do with decisive battles. That has nothing to do with battleships. That has to do with what sea power really is about. And in that age, and as we're seeing in our own world today, clearly, the movement of goods and peoples and services is paramount to what happens on the oceans.
Right. I mean, this is again part of the reason we really wanted to talk about Mahan is, of course, we're having this conversation right now where, when due to the conflict between the United States, Israel, various Gulf states to some degree, and Iran has managed to, if not close, largely shrink access to one of the most important maritime corridors in the world. And we are seeing the consequences of that globally. The Philippines, there's petrol shortages all across the country. In the United States, where we're probably more insulated from it than almost anywhere else in the world, I mean, gasoline prices are in the high 4s, at least here in Arizona. Um, Diesel prices are well over $5 a gallon, and diesel prices are significantly more important to the global economy than gasoline prices. So
Absolutely.
we're we're seeing, Mahan's general point, first of all, his general point, which is that the Navy exists to protect commerce. Um, we're seeing we're seeing that right now in the Strait of Hormuz. And on top of that, one of the key, and I want to just make sure we touch on this because if there is one other thing that he's known for, it is a naval strategic notion, which is that control of maritime choke points is what really matters.
Yeah.
He and Dr. Webster, I don't remember how many choke points he actually identifies, but there are several choke points on the oceans that Mahan identifies, and he says the ability to trade depends on having peaceful navigation through these choke points,
Yeah.
and that's best achieved by being able to project power over those choke points, naval power over those choke points. Um, the Strait of Hormuz, I don't know that he identified that as a choke point in the early 1890s, just because there was very little petroleum. Well, there was no petroleum coming out of the Middle East at the time. But the point stands that arguably in 2026, it's the most important maritime choke point, even if it's not one that Mahan identified.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think he's very much concerned with this, and one of the pieces you can see, because again, not only does the Strait of Hormuz maybe not be that valuable in his reading, but neither his, which doesn't exist yet, the Panama Canal, which he's advocating for across isthmus opening of some sort, whether it be in Panama where it eventually gets built or otherwise, because there were several other attempts to allow travel, especially for U.S. commerce and military forces, more quickly from coast to coast that way. And you can see it there, and you can see it in, there's several other large ones that both at that time and since that, Strait of Gibraltar, for example, Suez Canal, Strait of Malacca, as well. I mean, and of course, I mean, he's concerned and talking a lot about it because of the history and the time frame he's talking about. The English Channel, which often gets kind of ignored in the modern context as well. That's a huge piece of this discussion.
Right. I mean, it's not in his book, of course, because his book starts in 1660. But once after the Spanish Armada, the English controlled the English Channel,
Yeah.
and it was now non-threatened to the English Navy, to the English nation. And what does that do as a commercial power for the English?
Over the
Right.
another thing, just like the Strait of Gibraltar, them controlling that
Right.
for that entire period as well, right?
Right. And so, um, and I think this is, Mahan's writing in the 1890s, and this is after a century of warfare that has been primarily a land-based warfare century. The Battle of Trafalgar is a major naval engagement, but other than the Battle of Trafalgar, and there are other, consequential naval engagements of the 19th century, but when people think of the 19th century, they think of mass armies fighting each other, and that was where military thinking was in the late 19th century, especially in America. I mean, America had just done fighting a civil war that was primarily a land-based war. I don't want to diminish the important, role played by the Navy in both in the blockade and then controlling the Mississippi River. But when people think of the Civil War, even at the time, they were thinking of big armies moving against each other. This is the era of Jomini and Clausewitz in
Yeah.
military theorist perspectives, right? Um, and so when Mahan emerges and says, "No, no, 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 the land matters." But as a good Navy man, despite what maybe his father being an Army man, as a good Navy man, he argues that control of the sea is functionally what actually matters to being able to project power.
Yeah.
Um, and you mentioned the Panama Canal. This is a part of his thinking that I don't think is really appreciated enough. In that Mahan was one of the first people to really understand that the Panama Canal was going to get constructed, whether it was in Panama or in nearby country. I mean, the French had already constructed a railway across, that there was something that was going to get built there. And the British were looking at a place to build a canal. The French were looking at a place to build the canal. And Mahan understood that once you controlled, if the Americans could ever be the ones to build and control that canal, that would immediately make them a global maritime power, because that would, it would give them the ability to control a significant amount of the global commerce, just like the Suez Canal did for the English. And that if the United States sort of had a choice, either allow the Panama Canal to get built by somebody else and therefore never be a global maritime power, or build it themselves and become a global maritime power. Um, and obviously we know what happened. They chose the latter. But maybe it's worth talking a little bit, Joel, Dr. Webster, I should say. What, in your mind, what is the main purpose of American foreign policy in history?
The main purpose is to the benefit of the Americans. Is making sure that we have access to markets, that we have the ability to facilitate our trade. And again, this is what Mahan himself kind of articulates more broadly than just the American system. But the fact of having a navy is largely about maintaining shipping not only during peacetime but during wartime. Because if you can't keep your ships going during war, then you're probably going to lose, especially if you're maybe an island nation like England, for example, or even otherwise. But we see this happen to many countries throughout history. Germany during both world wars is that they get kind of cut off, and once you get cut off from markets, you get cut off from access to foodstuffs, even material for basic things like bandages and stuff like that. If you can't access this stuff, well then you basically are at the mercy of those who do control the ocean. And so especially in the modern context, in the 20th century, mid 20th century, especially after World War II into our modern current age, you're seeing this play out where that foreign policy and that the international rule of law in terms of what can happen or should happen on the oceans is in theory being maintained by the United States Navy. And again, we're seeing maybe the weaknesses of some of that is that even the Houthis, before now, before you talk about the Strait of Hormuz, but with Strait of Hormuz is if we can't protect shipping, not just our ships but everyone's ships, uh well, what good is our Navy to ourselves in the world?
Mhm. Right, I think that's exactly it. I mean, we're seeing right now the effects of the maritime insurance market on the fact that, um, the United States Navy, frankly, alone, maybe without expending, you could argue that perhaps the effort is not fully there, that, the United States is because the consequence of expending the maximum effort, which is what might be required in order to protect shipping going through the Strait of Hormuz, is so dangerous and such a gamble that, the United States has been unwilling to do that, I think for good reason, for some very good reasons. But it has left, so much of global commerce at the mercy of a hostile power. And, we look at American for and so it's easy to say, I just want to come back for one thing. I mean, I think it's easy to say, and this is something that the Marxist historians, or maybe not the Marxists, but the kind of the revisionist scholars of American foreign policy, people like Walter Lefebvre and William Appleman Williams, said that American foreign policy is fundamentally about markets, and I think that gets people's noses in a twist sometimes because they're like, no, 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 America stands for all of these wonderful, great liberal things, and it does, right? But those are related things because if the world, when we were talking last week about Thucydides, Athens was safer when the world was democratic,
Yep.
right? For Americans, Americans are safer when the world is liberal, and Americans are richer when the world is liberal. And part of the reason for that is because that allows individuals to be able to make purchasing and production decisions that American citizens can individuals can then take advantage of. It's about um, American foreign policy, although it's about markets, it's really fundamentally about ensuring an optimal American standard of living. and that involves access to markets, at least from the people's perspective who tend to be running it. There are, of course, other American foreign policy thinkers who think that no, in fact, trying to establish markets globally is not the right way to go about doing it. But fundamentally, this is an argument about what is best for the American standard of living. And Mahan believed that that required the ability to project power across the seas. And last week, again, we were talking about Thucydides, and just going back to your earlier point about how if you're a land-based power, um, and you can be cut off from the oceans, um, you're in real trouble. And conversely, if you're just a maritime power, you don't really need control of the land. If you have to choose between control of the land and control of the sea, the answer to Mahan is easy. It's control of the sea. When we were talking about the Peloponnesian War, early in the war, Pericles says, we want to make sure we focus on the navy. We have access to the sea. That way, the Spartans can rampage all over the peninsula, and we can come into our city walls, and we've got the long walls, so we can go down to the ocean, we can get to the sea, and we can get all the goods that we need. If we ever lose that ability, then we're in real trouble, right? And so even in the Peloponnesian War, the thing that allowed really up until a series of blunders forced Athens to collapse, and involved, and part of those blunders involved including allowing Sparta to bring in Persia, which was another major maritime power. Um, Athens is winning that war because of sea power.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other example that Mahan uses in the influence of sea power on history is the Second Punic War, where Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, is unmatched on the Italian peninsula. He, he sits there and basically occupies the Italian peninsula for something like 10 years in that war. And eventually, he is forced to fight a decisive battle in North Africa, after being called home. But how does Rome survive for 10 years when the Italian peninsula is occupied by a hostile army? Well, Rome always controlled the Mediterranean Sea and controlled the sea routes in that war. And that gave them the ability to move forces where they needed to move them, to evacuate forces if they had to move them, and to make sure that Rome themselves and the Roman citizens still had access to other parts of the Republican Empire.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about, last time with Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War as well, that this piece of part of what Athens is trying to do, not just with its own home port and its own home land, but with, the very famous dialogue with Milos and some of these other islands is at that time, again, the way naval power projection worked was you needed to stop very often, sometimes every night, if possible. Get the ship out of the water, keep it from, rotting or causing issues in that sense. And so you needed to have these places, these safe spaces to stop, to get food, to refuel, or simply just to pull the boat out of the water. And this is one of the things Mahan talks about in the modern sense is that what the U.S. needs for projection is in the early stages, again, at the time he's talking about is the transition's already starting to happen, but it hasn't fully happened. So he's talking mainly about getting fuel. And in this case, he means coal. And eventually it'll shift slightly to oil even during his time, but it's still coal. And so you need coal, but you also need foodstuffs. You need places for ammunition. You need these types of things. And so he's advocating for this, again, particularly in the Pacific, the Atlantic, and kind of that side of the ocean. He's a little less worried about the Pacific. He wants all these things. And so he talks about even, the Philippines. He talks about Hawaii, which if you're, again, familiar at all with the way the world has occurred since 1890, the U.S. takes both those places by force or otherwise, right? To acquire this space to maneuver and to refuel and to project that power.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really, thanks for bringing that up. And yeah, this is sort of Mahan is writing, for the most part, while most naval ships are coal. The British, and I can't remember the year, I think it might be 1899, 1901, where they start flipping to diesel. Well, not diesel, might be diesel actually, but uh, it's fuel anyway,
Yeah.
is how they always refer to it. And it's it, it's oil. So oil is initially what we think of petroleum. It's initially used to make kerosene, but by the 1890s, they're starting to find these other uses for it in factories and then transportation. And in the late 1890s, the British start flipping the Italians are the first to do it, and then the British start flipping their ships to fuel, which is, I mean, pretty big, pretty bold move, given that Britain controlled no fuel resources at the time and most of the significant coal deposits. So it was quite a gamble. Of course, it paid off. Um, so um, moving to the Strait of Hormuz, what first of all, how do you think Mahan would conceptualize the problem? And then maybe how would he suggest solving the problem?
Well, again, trying to look at this through his eyes, I think he would point out the failure of, which is actually what he called out the Americans for at the time he was writing, was the failure to think long term about all this, and to have planned for a navy that is capable of doing things. And you can see this in what's happened there already. Is, for the longest time, I mean, dating back to even I think before uh, both invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. had minesweepers in the Gulf, and they were pulled out like I think it was mere weeks before this operation started, and they're now sitting in like Philadelphia being decommissioned. So the only real true minesweepers that the U.S. Navy possesses, they don't exist anymore, or they're in the process of being made to not exist anymore. And so this concern of, well, not even just from missiles and air attacks, but from maybe mining operations, if that actually does occur at a large extent. That there's been reports of this happening, but most reports seem to not actually be completely verified that actually mining has occurred or not. But the fear of that is simply enough to stop enough ships simply to come through, because you would really want to risk that, right? But this is the Navy's failure to long term anticipate not just, I mean, arguably this strait, but any other choke point. Is all it would take is a couple mines to shut down, almost any of these places. Put some mines at both ends of the Suez Canal. Is anybody going to go through? No, right? And so the inability that the U.S. Navy, Department of Defense, whatever, to prepare for this is stark. The other piece of this too was not having enough, destroyers in the area that could both protect our assets, aka our carriers, but also protect shipping. It's because if you had enough of our destroyer deployed there, in theory you could run cover for ships going in and out.
Yeah, I mean, I just do want to just clarify one thing. The U.S. does still have mine uh, mine sweeping like
They,
ships
they, they
that
have
are
patrol
that
ships that are capable of it in theory.
well
Yes.
they've got the literal ships, yeah, but they
Yeah.
also have two of the Avenger class are still in operation. They're just in
Okay.
Singapore.
Okay.
Or
So
one's in
useless.
Singapore and one's in
Yeah.
Japan. Pardon me. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're not
Yeah.
useful right now, but they do actually
Yeah.
have them. The four that were in Bahrain were recently decommissioned, and the idea is that they would be replaced by the literal combat ships that have minesweeping capabilities.
That
And
might have
whether,
been canceled too, right?
pardon me, they
It might
might
have
have
been
been.
canceled since then too.
Yeah. No, I think they're actually I just want to confirm that. No, the USS Canberra was the first to arrive on in the Middle East on May 22nd. And yeah, there's three of them there. There's three of
Okay.
them in Bahrain. Um, but the problem is I can never keep track of I mean, trying to keep track of what's actually happening in an active maritime war zone is very difficult. So I don't actually. I mean, this information is 4 days old. I have no idea if it's actually accurate or not. So,
Yeah.
um, But yeah, and this goes back to your point, like, you know, we're getting different perspectives on whether they've actually managed to lay mines or not. And here's the thing, if you and I don't know if they're laying mines or not, what would you do if you were the captain of a tanker anchored somewhere in the Persian Gulf right now?
Have
Let alone,
assume
I mean, let's assume you could get married. Let's assume you could get war insurance from somebody, you know?
well, I mean, I would not sure I want to risk that depending on a lot of factors, but I don't think I would risk that.
Right. And so this is we're living in a world of uncertainty where it doesn't matter. And, we had the Secretary of Defense a couple of days ago say, the strait is open. It's just up to Iran whatever that statement was, it probably wasn't the smart, probably wasn't the best thought through thing. But ultimately, he's kind of right in the sense that there's really, there's nothing. It's not like there's a ship stuck in the middle of it like happened in the Suez Canal several
Yeah.
years ago. It's not like there's an active blockade. It is technically open. And, you know, I would expect that you could probably get through, but it's the uncertainty. It's a gamble. Can you? It's the same thing with the Barbary pirates off the north shore of Africa, off the north coast of Africa during the early, in the early 19th century. Most ships were fine, but it's not about most ships. You need to have certainty that you aren't going to be harassed by an enemy power, by pirates or some hostile or Houthis or whatever, in order to be willing to gamble and make that voyage. So I think you're right. I mean, I think this is one of the first things that Mahan would have said is that, being prepared is the most important aspect. And also having your ships in position, even assuming you have the assets, making sure that they're in position. See, during the First World War, the, one of the things I've never been able to figure out is the German North Sea Fleet was in port when they declared war,
Yep. No long-term
and they
plan.
stayed there basically the entire war.
Yeah.
I mean, one of their fleets was out, but most of their most important assets were stuck in the North Sea or were stuck in Wilhelmshaven.
Yeah.
And so just if you're listening to this podcast and you intend to declare war at some time, m- probably make sure your ships are not in port and easily blockaded.
Yeah.
Um, and so maybe moving out a little bit. What is, you know, Mahan gets argued against by a guy named H.J. Mackinder, who's a British kind of polymath, I guess, probably call him. He argued that in fact what really matters is controlling the Eurasian continent, the resources of the Eurasian continent. And the Mahanians are sort of like, nah, that only matters if you can get things places. And as long as you have global interconnections, the sea commons, as he calls it, is the most important, the most more important. Um, what what does the Strait of Hormuz, the current situation in the Strait of Hormuz, at a Mahanian maybe perspective, what does this mean for overall American foreign policy?
Well, I
It's a
mean,
tough question, but
yeah, that is a tough question, but I think it's at least twofold, in that sense. The one is kind of reiterating what I said earlier about this preparation piece, and that the U.S. and again, I mean, lots of people have been calling attention to this, but I don't think it's manifested, into enough action. The Trump administration has at least vocally said that they're trying to support a lot of these changes to beef up the military, particularly the Navy's capabilities. But by and large, the American naval project has been kind of in neglect since at least World War II, if not shortly thereafter. But you have a lot of these changes that have occurred that you know, the inability to kind of produce new ships, or at least produce them effectively and efficiently and on budget, these types of questions. Um, you know, every new carrier that's come out has had major issues, from things as simple as plumbing and, other things that have kind of limited their effectiveness and the readiness. And, in theory, we have, I think, what now, 10, on paper, 10 aircraft carriers that are capable of combat operations. But at most points of time, maybe half of those are actually, functioning or able to be, deployed. Um, and one of them right now is, on their like third extension, I think, for this deployment. So these problems, about construction, production, um, and then even just that refitting piece too is like refueling is an issue, but more importantly, is refitting is, especially when you're dealing with, say, Iranian drones, swarms of those, is the systems that can fight those on destroyers or other, ships. Well, those have to be refueled and refitted and replaced. And can you do that at sea? Well, probably not in an active combat zone. So you got to pull back a little bit. But how far are you going to have to travel to do that? Are you going to have to actually go back to port? Or are you going to have to, do that? Do you have enough resupply ships that can do that maybe on the ocean? Some of them can, some of them can't. And so you have these complications of what are you trying to do as a Navy? And what is the U.S. trying to do? I'm not really sure anymore. In theory, we're a seven ocean Navy, but I'm not sure the U.S. is actually capable of that at any time now. Is it, clearly this issue in and around the Strait of Hormuz is occupying a ton of the Navy. Could they deal with another major threat anywhere else right now? Probably not.
Probably not. Now, I will say, I mean, if in human history, if you ever had a major naval, um, this is fundamentally this is a naval issue. Yes, it's an air power issue. Yes, and missiles and air defense and that kind of thing. But fundamentally, this is a naval exercise. And I mean, I don't know if there'd ever be a navy in human history that could have, again, adjusting for scale. Um, this is the sort of crisis that would involve take almost every tool of your navy. I don't care how big you want to conceptualize it to being. You're going to mobilize all of your assets in order to deal with this. I think. Um, the question is whether they can actually deal with it, which is a different question.
Yeah.
Um, I do want to talk about your point about the naval project being um, eroded since the Second World War. This is an I will admit to being a Navy partisan in this case, like Mahan. I am a Navy partisan. I do think that the Navy is still the most effective way to project power globally. As Mahan, and your point about refitting in places uh, to be able to do that, it is a good thing. Or the Americans couldn't do this without being forward deployed, and Mahan would have said, "Yes, you need to be forward deployed." And that was in fact one of his major recommendations was to be a, was to forward deploy. Um, but the naval um naval construction, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't believe forgetting the word is an obvious word. But procurement, naval procurement in every major country is an exercise in job creation. It's not an exercise in actually making a navy an effective navy, especially at a cost productive level, at a cost efficient level. I mean, if we look at Australia, any virtually every naval ship or every naval asset is constructed with the notion of making sure that the Adelaide ship stakeholders are looked after. In Canada, it's about making sure that Davie Shipyard in Quebec and Irving Shipyard in Halifax are getting an effective amount of jobs. That is the lens through which um, it's all done. And in the United States, it's no different, though the US is slightly better at it because at least they construct ships eventually. Some
Sometimes.
that yeah, I mean, but that there's a lot of stakeholders in Virginia right, that depend on naval contracts, and that is, and whether or, Mobile, Alabama, and then, oh god, why can't I think of the port in Mississippi? Um, anyway, drawing a blank
Yeah.
on it. But
Yeah.
there are there are key political stakeholders here that you need to satisfy with your procurement with your procurement. That is not a cost-effective way to build a navy, and no and every country does it this way. Again, at least the United States can still roll a Virginia class submarine, can still launch a Virginia class submarine now and again. No other country can really do that. The United States wants to complain, and I think rightly so, about the lack of investment that's been done by allied nations in their own navies. It's not really that the money hasn't been spent. A lot of money has been spent. It's just been about satisfying domestic political stakeholders. It hasn't actually been about creating navies. And so you're at the point now where I think the French have two aircraft carriers that are
Yeah.
operational.
Yeah.
The
Sure.
British have one and a half. Um, and in of the Western maritime nations, that's it
Yep.
to go along with the 10 on paper that the United States has. Now, not everything is aircraft carriers. Frigates are incredibly important. Destroyers are incredibly important. Submarines are incredibly important. Not to mention other various types of joint support ships, littoral combat ships. Um, but if your goal is to satisfy political stakeholders, eventually that is going to um, that's going to reflect itself in the capabilities and the quality of your Navy. And that is not to suggest that the American Navy is not still the greatest naval force on earth by a lot. But it is, at least in from the construction perspective, um, kind of a boondoggle, which, by the way, Mahan recognized in the 1880s.
Yep.
One of the most corrupt places on the planet in the country were Navy shipyards. And in fact, Mahan did a stint, I think, as the director of one, and he was spent the whole time trying to clean it up, but he kind of failed.
Yeah. I mean, it's again about that sense of kind of long term thinking, and he talked about this so much in all of his works. This question of you know, you, because again, part of why these things are money traps, shipyards, and places potentially for corruption and stuff like that is because most times they're not short term projects.
Mhm.
Is you're not just building one ship, and you're not building just one ship in a year or whatever. That's it. Is that you're working maybe on multiple ships at the same time, on different types of ships. Uh, you may be doing parts of ones here and there and things like that. Where this is dragged out, and again, it's also a long term investment in terms of repairs, and so this isn't just something you just wake up one day and you're like, we're going to build a navy, or we're going to maintain a navy, and you have to commit to it, and this is what a lot of people in the West have been rightfully kind of concerned about is China's growing naval power because of this, because they've clearly committed to they want to be that. Now, do they actually want to replace the U.S. in that role of kind of patrolling the oceans or whatever? I don't know. I don't really know if they've completely thought that far ahead, but and they probably are looking at what's happening now and going, we don't want to deal with that headache, maybe. But even with that, they have clearly committed to this building project, and are you know building and testing and pumping out all types of ships. Again, not just carriers, which is getting the most attention, but even things like submarines. I mean, their most recent facility, they can build like 4 submarines at a single time, indoors, protected, from both spies and otherwise. And it's like the U.S. isn't doing that. It hasn't done that, and so if the U.S. is going to continue to want to do this, and want to focus its foreign policy not just on commerce but protecting American interest at home and abroad, it's going to have to recommit itself to being a naval power.
Yeah. I definitely think that's right. And here's one of the things. I mean, before the Second World War, um, the Navy was one of two branches,
Yep.
right? Now it's one of four.
Yep.
And the army is always going to attract a lot of resources for good reason. And I think people, just voters, perhaps, and your ordinary stakeholders, even not just, understand a tank. I think they intuitively understand artillery and they understand air defense. Mm. I It becomes a lot harder to justify the vast volumes of public expenditure that's required to build a littoral combat ship,
Yeah.
right? Navies require, like, are the value of the Navy, although it's a little intuitive, is not wildly intuitive. It's not the same as an army or and even an air force, right? Is, you know, all of the various challenges related to procuring the F-35, getting the F-35 combat ready. Now, it's proving its worth right now, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
It has over the last several weeks. But, um, so if you're the Navy and you're trying to get money for destroyers, or you're trying to get money for new frigates, or God forbid, new aircraft carriers, man, that's a hard fight when you're competing against the other branches. And you're probably the least understood branch still.
Yeah. Well, and it's even deeper than that in some ways because I mean, unless you've lived in a coastal area or you have family that was in the Navy or you've maybe been to some of these places and seen some of these ships, um, I think it's hard to fathom. If you're you live in like rural Iowa or something, and you're a farmer or otherwise, and it's like why are all these tax dollars going to build an aircraft carrier, and you're not understanding not only its function and purpose and the importance of it long term or short term, but even really understanding like the scale of these things. I mean, we're talking about a thing that is, our biggest carriers hold at least 6,000 people at a given time. That's not a ship. That's a city. That's a small city.
Well, I mean, people, it sounds so dumb when you actually think about it. But an aircraft carrier is a floating airport.
Yeah.
It's a floating air base you can take wherever you want to take it on the
Yep.
oceans. And yeah, that requires a lot of people. I mean, I've never seen the Ford, the USS Ford, but having walked on the Yorktown at just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And that's an old World War II era aircraft carrier. How huge it is. My poor wife was pregnant at the time, and I was dragging her all over the ship. But it's uh, it's astonishing actually, and the
Yep.
Ford is a lot bigger than that.
Oh yeah.
And on top of that, you've got nuclear engines just
Yep.
to make things even more challenge. But the nuclear engine avoids some of the problem that Mahan was worried about with coal stations and refueling stations. Now it can be at sea permanently in theory if it
In
needs to be.
theory. Yeah.
Um, but anyway, let's finish on this. Do you think Mahan would, and maybe it's too late for that. I mean, I think maybe but if Mahan was advising the president right now, do you think he would argue that he make a deal in order to protect with Iran, in order to make sure that that ships are able to effectively transport it again? Or do you think he would advise, no, we'll suffer in the short term, but we better make sure that we get full control of this thing when we're done?
Yeah, that's a good question. It feels like Mahan would probably advocate for the latter in terms of trying to make sure that after the smoke settles, that the U.S. either directly or indirectly has control of this access point. And again, that's based primarily just on his thinking about kind of the Panama Canal and some of the other controls of these things. But, I would argue to a certain degree, regardless of how it's actually played out, maybe, I do think Trump's actions here have actually reflected that at least he or some of his advisors are actually really concerned about these things, because it's not just Strait of Hormuz, but control of finding the cartels, supposedly shooting the ships down near Venezuela and all that. The concern over the Bering Strait, the concern over ship access to all these places, he's clearly concerned about these choke points. And so at a certain level, regardless of any other motivation, I do think that's a central component to why this war with Iran has even broken out in the first place, is that there's concern about maintaining access to these locations, that some in the U.S. anyway, I don't know who or how many, but someone in the administration, someone in the Pentagon, these people you know, read Mahan and didn't ignore everything else other than decisive battles. They understood that these choke points and that these points of contention and potential to kind of stifle trade and commerce and mobility, they must be controlled, or you don't control the seas.
Right. That's the key. They must be controlled or you don't control the seas. And I think you're absolutely right. That is, um, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, forgetting for a moment, neither you nor I are naval strategists or tacticians. I don't know what it's going to take to control the Strait of to control the Iranian coast of the Strait of Hormuz and therefore deny Iranian access to the Strait of Hormuz, to harry commerce going through the Strait of Hormuz. But if that could ever be accomplished, it would prevent Iran from holding a knife to the throat of international commerce, which I mean, I always knew it did, but I suppose until 10 or 15 days ago, I guess I didn't realize how much of a knife it held to the throat of international commerce. And if we look
Yeah.
at, Iran's, um, you know, what were its various means of deterrence? If we ignore the nuclear weapons side of things here for a second, it was its regional proxy groups. It was its ballistic missile program. It was the general, up until recently, dislike or distrust of everybody in the region towards the Israelis, and the potential that if they ever got into a war with the Israelis, the Gulf states might actually join the Iranian side. And then the fourth one is the ability um, to shut the Strait of Hormuz. Remarkably, we're at a point where that's the only one it has left.
Yeah. Which is again is why the U.S. has to. I mean, there's various ways to do this, but I've seen several pretty good recommendations for it. But that's why the U.S. has to fully open it. They have to
Yeah,
prove that ships can travel that safely. And again, I think the best way is going to do it is that true show of force. Get as many destroyers as you can possibly get there. Basically, line them up and down that coastline, and say, the door's open. Come on,
I agree.
wave the American flag. Have the anti-air capabilities, and make sure mines are not being laid, and if they will be, whatever. But protect that channel and prove that this entity that everyone's supposed to buy into, and that American foreign policy essentially exists to flex, is capable of doing these things. Because if we're not, I mean, this also opens the door for potential enemies or adversaries to see maybe a moment of weakness, and a weakening American state, in terms of projection power and all that. Where if the U.S. can't do it, someone else will. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be China necessarily, but someone's going to have to step up to protect the oceans if the U.S. is incapable.
Thank you very much for answering the question that I wish I'd asked. I didn't ask the question really the way, I mean, I didn't, I couldn't think of a better way to ask the question, and you did a good job answering, but then you answered the better question, which was, what does lingering uncertainty mean? if the United States comes to some sort of agreement with Iran that allows for a certain number of ships or a certain number of whatever to transit the Strait of Hormuz on a regular basis, or generally it looks like there's an agreement but where Iran still gets something to say about it, that will not satisfy here
Nope.
anymore. Maybe it would have 6 weeks ago, but it didn't now, but it doesn't now.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, Dr. Webster, thank you very much. That was fun.
No.
Glad we were able to have that discussion, and we'll have you on again soon. I guess not to talk Thucydides or Mahan, but we'll find something.
Yeah, we'll find something, and I'll be back.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.